All right, let's dive deep into this. Picture this. It's a warm summer night in Fairfield, Ohio, a quiet suburban town where nothing ever really happens until it does. Katelyn Markham was a 22-year-old art student with her whole life ahead of her. She was studying at the Art Institute of Ohio, known for her creativity, her kindness, and the way she lit up a room with her presence. She had dreams of moving away, starting a new life, and making a name for herself in the art world. But most importantly, she had people who loved her. One of those people was John Carter, her high school sweetheart. They had been together for 6 years, and by all appearances they were the picture of young love. They had plans, big ones. Marriage was on the horizon. They even talked about moving to Colorado, a fresh start for both of them. But as we all know, appearances can be deceiving. The night of August 13th, 2011, started off like any other. It was a Saturday and Katelyn was at home in the townhouse she shared with her father, David Markham. She had been busy finishing up some last-minute projects for school. She was just weeks away from graduation. It should have been an exciting time in her life, a time of celebration and anticipation. But instead, this night would become the last time anyone ever saw her alive. John Carter later told police that he had been with Katelyn that evening but left around midnight. They had been texting, and everything seemed normal, more so he claimed. The last known communication from Katelyn's phone was a text sent at 12:52 a.m. on August 14th, replying to a message from John. It was short, casual, nothing that screamed distress or danger. But after that, silence. No more texts, no calls, no social media activity. Just nothing. The next day, August 14th, John claimed he tried to reach her. He sent texts, called her phone, but she wasn't answering. That was strange. Katelyn was always responsive, always checking in. But maybe she was just busy, right? Maybe she overslept or got caught up in something. That's what people do. Except when John finally went over to her townhouse later that day, something felt off. The door was locked. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no struggle. Everything looked perfectly normal except for one very disturbing detail. Katelyn was gone. Her car was still parked outside. Her keys were inside the house. Her purse, ID, and credit cards, all still there. It was as if she had just stepped out for a moment and vanished into thin air. The only thing missing, her phone and Katelyn herself. At this point, most people would be freaking out. I mean, your fiancée is missing, her stuff is all still there, and she's not answering her phone. Red flags all over the place. But when John finally called 911, his tone was strange. Instead of panic or desperation, he sounded calm, too calm, almost rehearsed. Yeah, I need to report a missing person. My fiancée. I haven't seen her since last night. No frantic pleas for help. No urgency in his voice. Just a casual, almost detached explanation of the situation. The dispatcher asked him for details: where she was last seen, what she was wearing, when he last talked to her. And the more John spoke, the more people started questioning if he was telling the full truth. The police arrived shortly after, and they were just as puzzled as everyone else. There were no signs of a break-in, no blood, no struggle, nothing. It was as if Katelyn had just disappeared into the night. But here's where things get even weirder. John started telling people that he believed Katelyn had been taken, but he didn't know by who. He also made some bizarre comments, like suggesting that maybe she walked away on her own, which made absolutely no sense. Why would a woman just up and leave her whole life behind, right before graduation, without her purse, car, or even keys? Then there was the fact that John failed multiple polygraph tests. Twice. That's right, when police started digging deeper, they asked John to take a polygraph, and he failed. Now we all know lie detectors aren't 100% reliable, but failing twice? That's not a great look. Meanwhile, Katelyn's family and friends were desperate. They searched everywhere. Flyers were put up all over town. People combed through parks, woods, abandoned buildings, anywhere she could have been. But there was nothing. Not a single clue about what had happened to her. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, Fairfield started feeling the weight of Katelyn's disappearance. Everyone had theories. Some believed she had been abducted. Others thought she had been murdered, but by who? And why? One person kept coming up in the conversation. John Carter. People couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. His behavior was odd. His interviews with the media felt forced, almost staged. He wasn't acting like a man who had just lost the love of his life. He was acting like a man playing a role. But here's the problem: there was no evidence, no body, no murder weapon, no crime scene. Just a girl who had vanished into the night, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. And for nearly 2 years, that's all Katelyn's case was, a mystery. Until April 2013, when a couple of men illegally dumping trash in a wooded area made a discovery that would change everything. All right, let's talk about the last person known to have spoken to Katelyn Markham before she vanished. John Carter, her fiancé, her high school sweetheart, the person who, by all accounts, should have been the closest to her. The person she was planning to spend the rest of her life with. Now, whenever someone goes missing under mysterious circumstances, you know who law enforcement always looks at first. The boyfriend, husband, fiancé, whoever was closest to the victim. Statistically speaking, it's almost always someone they knew. And in this case, that person was John Carter. John and Katelyn had been together for 6 years. They met in high school, fell in love, and had been inseparable ever since. To the outside world, their relationship seemed solid. They had plans, big ones. They talked about getting married, about moving away together to Colorado, about building a life as partners. But beneath that seemingly perfect surface, things weren't as picture perfect as they appeared. In the months leading up to her disappearance, people started noticing cracks in their relationship. Katelyn's close friends mentioned that she had been feeling uncertain about her future with John. She wasn't sure if she wanted to get married yet. She had dreams of her own, ambitions beyond Fairfield, Ohio, and there were moments when she seemed hesitant about what her next step should be. Now, was that enough for John to harm her? Maybe not. But here's where things get weird. On the night of August 13th, 2011, John Carter was the last known person to talk to Katelyn. He later told police that he had spent the evening at Katelyn's townhouse. They were hanging out, texting, talking about the future. But what exactly happened during those last few hours? That's where the story starts to get murky. John claimed that he left her house sometime around midnight. He said everything was fine, there was nothing unusual, no argument, no signs that anything bad was about to happen. At 12:52 a.m., Katelyn's phone sent a final text message to John. That was the last anyone ever heard from her. Think about that. A woman on the verge of graduating with her entire future ahead of her suddenly stops responding to calls and texts, and the only person who can account for her last moments is her fiancé. But here's where it gets even more unsettling. The next day, John starts calling Katelyn's phone. No answer. He texts her. No response. He waits. Still nothing. At first, he doesn't panic. He assumes maybe she's busy, maybe she slept in, maybe she went out. But when the hours keep passing and he still can't reach her, he decides to go over to her house. And that's when he realizes something is seriously wrong. He gets there and finds her car parked outside. Her keys inside the house. Her purse, wallet, and ID still there. Everything she would normally take with her if she had left on her own, untouched. The only things missing, Katelyn and her phone. Now, at this point, any normal person would be freaking out. Imagine walking into your significant other's house, seeing all their stuff there, but they're just gone. It wouldn't make sense. You'd be calling 911 immediately, running around, knocking on doors, looking for answers. But John's reaction? It was oddly calm. When he finally did call 911, his tone was not what you'd expect from a frantic fiance. Instead of sounding panicked or desperate, he sounded collected. Too collected. Yeah, I need to report a missing person. My fiancée, I haven't seen her since last night. No urgency, no emotion, no please help me find her. Just cold, matter of fact, like he was reporting a stolen bicycle, not the sudden and unexplained disappearance of the woman he was supposed to marry. And then, when police started questioning him, his story started feeling off. For one, he was inconsistent. He claimed they had a good night together. No arguments, no tension, but then other people started coming forward with a different picture. Some of Katelyn's friends said she had expressed doubts about the relationship, that she wasn't fully sure she wanted to marry John, that she was thinking about moving to Colorado alone without him. Was it possible that John knew she was planning to leave him? And then there was the fact that he failed 2 polygraph tests. Red flag number 1. He didn't seem that worried about Katelyn being gone. Red flag number 2. He failed lie detector tests. Now polygraphs aren't 100% reliable, but when you fail 2 of them, that's a pretty big deal. That's not just nerves, that's deception. And yet, despite all of this, there was no physical evidence to tie John to Katelyn's disappearance. No blood, no signs of a struggle, nothing concrete. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. For a while, John kept talking to the media, doing interviews, trying to come across as a heartbroken fiancé. But the way he spoke about Katelyn, it felt strange, almost detached. In one interview, instead of pleading for her safe return, he referred to her in the past tense, something that immediately raised suspicion. It was subtle, but it gave people the impression that he already knew she wasn't coming back. And then, in another bizarre moment, he made a chilling statement when asked what he thought had happened to Katelyn. He said, "I think somebody took her. Not I think she's missing. Not I don't know what happened. Not I just want her back. But I think somebody took her." It was a strange thing to say, almost as if he was planting a narrative trying to shift suspicion away from himself. For months, the investigation kept coming back to him. But the problem? No proof. No murder weapon. No clear crime scene. Nothing, just a fiancé with a strange demeanor, failed lie detector tests, and a whole lot of unanswered questions. For nearly 2 years, people wondered, was John Carter guilty? Then, in April 2013, the case took a shocking turn when Katelyn's remains were discovered in a garbage bag in area 30 minutes from her home. And suddenly, everything changed. Alright, let's get into one of the most baffling and unsettling details of Katelyn Markham's disappearance. The fact that when she vanished, there were absolutely no signs of forced entry, and almost all of her belongings were still inside her home. Now let's really break this down. When someone goes missing under suspicious circumstances, you usually expect to see some sort of struggle. A broken window, a kicked-in door, things knocked over, maybe even some kind of evidence that the person fought back. But with Katelyn, there was nothing. It was like she had just vanished into thin air. When her fiancé, John Carter, showed up at her townhouse the next day, after she stopped responding to his texts and calls, he found everything exactly as it should have been except for one very crucial thing. Katelyn was gone. Her car was still parked outside. Her keys were inside the house. Her purse, wallet, ID, credit cards all untouched. Now think about that for a second. If someone was planning to leave voluntarily, just take off and disappear, you'd expect them to take the basics, right? Their car, money, ID, at the very least, their house keys. But Katelyn left behind everything. The only things missing, Katelyn herself and her phone. That fact alone raises so many questions. Let's go through the possibilities. Scenario 1, Katelyn left willingly. Some people might say, well, maybe she just walked out on her own, maybe she needed space, maybe she was meeting someone. But that theory falls apart quickly. Why? Because people who leave willingly don't usually just vanish off the grid. They don't leave their cars, their money, their ID, their entire life behind with no explanation. Plus, Katelyn was just weeks away from graduating from the Art Institute of Ohio. She was on the verge of achieving a huge milestone in her life. This wasn't someone who was looking to just disappear. Then there's the fact that she didn't tell anyone she was leaving. Not her dad, not her fiancé, not her closest friends. Not one single person. And let's be real, when was the last time you heard of someone, especially a young woman, leaving their house in the middle of the night without their purse, phone, charger, car, or keys, and not at least telling someone? It just doesn't add up. Scenario 2, she was taken against her will. Now this is where things get disturbing. If someone kidnapped Katelyn, how did they do it without a struggle? There were no broken locks, no forced entry, no overturned furniture, no blood, nothing. The apartment looked completely normal. So if she was taken, it means one of two things. 1, she knew her abductor and willingly let them in. 2, she was lured outside and then taken. Either way, this points to something premeditated. Now let's look at the first possibility: she knew her abductor. This theory makes a lot of sense because there were no signs of a break-in. That means if someone was in the house with Katelyn that night, she likely let them in herself. And who's the most likely person she would have let in? John Carter. He was her fiancé. He had been with her that night. He had a key to the house. He was the last person to hear from her before she vanished. He also had a motive. Katelyn had reportedly been having doubts about their future. She had mentioned wanting to move to Colorado, possibly without John. Was he afraid of losing her? Did something happen that night? And then there's the second possibility: she was lured outside. This scenario is chilling because it suggests that whoever took her knew exactly what they were doing. They managed to get Katelyn to leave her house without a struggle, without grabbing her purse or keys. Was it someone she trusted? Someone she thought she could step outside for just a minute to talk to? Was it a planned abduction? Or was it something even more sinister? Was Katelyn forced out of her home by someone who had the power to control her? Because here's another eerie thought: what if she was coerced? What if someone texted her or called her and said something designed to get her outside? Maybe something like, "Hey, come outside, I need to talk to you." Or even worse, "Come outside, something happened, I need your help." Think about how easy it would be to trick someone into stepping out of their home, especially late at night, when their guard is down. Once Katelyn was outside, she was vulnerable. And after that, she was gone. This would explain why there were no signs of forced entry, why her car, purse, and keys were still inside, and why the only thing missing besides Katelyn was her phone. Because maybe her abductor took her phone so she couldn't call for help. Or maybe she had it in her hand, texting or calling someone right before she disappeared. And here's the scariest part: we still don't know exactly how it happened. We just know that Katelyn didn't leave on her own. We know that something happened that night, something that took her away from everything and everyone she knew, leaving behind nothing but a silent, untouched apartment and a million unanswered questions. For nearly 2 years, there were no answers. Just a missing young woman, a grieving father, and a fiancé whose story never quite seemed to add up. Then in April 2013, the truth finally started to surface, because Katelyn's body was about to be found. All right, let's talk about what happened nearly 2 years after Katelyn Markham disappeared, when the mystery of where she had gone finally came to a horrifying conclusion. For months after Katelyn vanished, her family, her friends, and the entire community of Fairfield, Ohio, were left in a state of limbo. Imagine waking up every day not knowing if someone you love is dead or alive, not knowing if they're out there somewhere waiting to be found, or if something terrible has already happened. That's the kind of torment Katelyn's family had to live with. Her case had no leads, no suspects, no major developments. The police had questioned John Carter, her fiancé, multiple times. They had searched wooded areas, questioned friends and co-workers, followed every possible tip, and yet nothing. It was like Katelyn had just vanished off the face of the earth. And then, April 7, 2013, 2 years after she was last seen, Katelyn Markham was found. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon in Cedar Grove, Indiana, a small rural area about 30 minutes from Katelyn's home in Fairfield, Ohio. That's where a man named Dave Marshall was out scavenging for scrap metal near a creek bed. He was looking for anything valuable, old cans, discarded metal parts, things he could salvage. But what he found was something he would never forget. As he walked through the brush, he noticed something that seemed out of place, something wrapped in plastic, lying near the water. At first, he wasn't sure what he was looking at, but as he got closer, he realized it was a garbage bag. A large, black plastic bag, torn open with something inside. And when he looked inside, he saw human remains. Let that sink in for a second. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. This was a homicide. The police were called immediately, and when investigators arrived, they confirmed what Dave Marshall already suspected. These were the remains of a woman, but who she was, they couldn't say just yet. The body was so badly decomposed that she couldn't be immediately identified. Think about that. Nearly 2 years in the elements, exposed to rain, wind, and wildlife, had left her remains almost unrecognizable. The body was taken to the coroner's office, and DNA testing was ordered. Everyone already had a gut feeling about who this was, but the official confirmation came just a few days later. The remains were Katelyn Markham. For her family, it was the moment they had been dreading. The small sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, Katelyn was still out there somewhere, alive, was completely shattered. She was dead, and not only that, someone had dumped her body in a garbage bag like she was trash. Now, let's stop and talk about that for a second. The manner in which a body is disposed of can tell you a lot about the crime. And in this case, the fact that Katelyn was found in a garbage bag, dumped in a remote area, suggests something very specific. Whoever did this wanted her gone, hidden, erased. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was calculated. This was personal. And here's where it gets even more disturbing. Her cause of death could not be determined. The autopsy report stated that, due to the condition of her remains, there was no way to say for sure how she died. There were no visible gunshot wounds, no obvious signs of blunt force trauma, nothing that immediately screamed murder. But let's be real. A young woman doesn't end up in a garbage bag in the middle of nowhere by accident. And here's another unsettling detail. Her remains were found right on the Indiana-Ohio border, just far enough away from Fairfield, Ohio, that it seemed like someone was trying to make sure she wouldn't be easily found. Think about it. If someone wanted to cover up a crime, they wouldn't dump the body in their own backyard. They'd drive just far enough to avoid suspicion, just far enough that the jurisdiction might change, that the investigation might hit a dead end. And for almost 2 years, that plan worked, until nature had other plans. Because, here's the thing, the place where Katelyn's remains were found, that area had been prone to flooding. Over time, the water levels shifted, the landscape changed, and eventually, that garbage bag, hidden away for so long, was exposed. If it hadn't been for that, if it hadn't been for Dave Marshall stumbling upon it, Katelyn's body might have never been found. average minds were found because he had never been talked to him. Why was it Katelyn? Because he was the worst. It probably had been off. And here's something even more bizarre. When a recording of John Carter's 911 call from the night he reported Katelyn missing was analyzed by audio experts, they picked up on something chilling. There was a point in the call where he seemed to whisper something under his breath, something that sounded like, "I killed her." Now, was that 100% confirmed? No. Some people heard it, some people, but the fact that it was even a possibility raised serious red flags. And yet, despite all of this, no arrests were made. The police had no concrete evidence linking John or anyone to the crime. They had a body, a location, a missing woman turned murder victim, but no proof of who put her there. And so, the case stalled. For nearly a decade, Katelyn's murder remained unsolved. Her father, Dave Markham, continued to push for justice, to beg for answers, to keep her story alive. But the person who put her in that garbage bag, they were still walking free. Until, years later, something finally changed. All right? So let's talk about one of the most frustrating and infuriating aspects of this entire case. The fact that even after Katelyn Markham's remains were found, the cause of death couldn't be determined. Imagine that for a second. After almost 2 years of searching, waiting, hoping, Katelyn's family finally got the worst possible news. She was dead, but instead of at least getting some answers, instead of knowing what had happened to her, they were left with another mystery. How did she die? That should have been the next piece of the puzzle. That should have told investigators exactly what they were dealing with. But because of the condition of Katelyn's remains, they couldn't determine how she had been killed. And that made everything so much harder. Let's break this down. When her body was discovered in that garbage bag, in that remote area of Indiana, the first major problem was that she had been out there for too long. Nearly 2 years of exposure to the elements had left her remains badly decomposed. The medical examiner couldn't tell if she had been strangled, suffocated, stabbed, or beaten. There were no clear signs of trauma, at least not any that could be identified on what was left of her body, and that, right there, is exactly what her killer was counting on. Exactly what her home was counting on. They took her to a secluded, out of the way from her home, that would be considered a far away from her home, that would be connected to a case. A place far enough away from her home that wouldn't be connected to a case. And they put her in a garbage bag. Now, let's talk about that for a second. A garbage bag. Think about what that really means. That's not just about hiding a body. That's dehumanizing. That's someone saying this person is nothing. This person is disposable. And it also suggests something very calculated, because a plastic bag, unlike a shallow grave or an open field, can limit the evidence left behind. It can slow down decomposition, it can prevent animals from disturbing the remains, and most importantly, it can hide DNA evidence. Because let's be honest, if Katelyn's body had been found intact, if she had been discovered weeks instead of years later, they might have found bruising, marks, wounds, clear proof of exactly what happened to her. But because she was in that bag, because she had been left out there so long, Any physical evidence of how she died was gone, and that meant her killer was still one step ahead. Now, even though the coroner couldn't officially determine the cause of death, there was one thing everyone agreed on. This was a homicide. Katelyn did not end up in that bag in the middle of nowhere by accident. She didn't just wander off, lay down and die. She didn't place herself in a garbage bag. Someone put her there. Someone dumped her body, and that meant someone killed her. But without a clear cause of death, the police were stuck. Because in a murder case, the cause of death is crucial. Think about it. If investigators could have said she was strangled, that would have immediately narrowed down the suspect list. Strangulation, for example, is personal. It's intimate. It's something killers do when they know their victims, when they want control, when they want to watch the life leave their eyes. If they had found knife wounds, that could have meant a crime of passion. Something done in anger, in the heat of the moment. If there had been gunshot wounds, that could have pointed to a different kind of suspect. Someone with access to a weapon, someone who maybe didn't want to get too close. But without any of that information, all they could say was, "We know she was murdered, we just don't know how," and that made it so much easier for her killer to keep walking free. Now, let's be real. There were suspects. There were theories. The most obvious name on the list? John Carter. Her fiancé, the last person to speak to her, the one who called 911 in what many people believed was a staged, rehearsed call. The one who failed not just one but 2 polygraph tests. But with no cause of death, there was no way to tie him or anyone to the crime. Think about how terrifying that is. Someone got away with this. Someone murdered a young woman, threw her away like trash, and walked away without leaving a single piece of forensic evidence behind. And because there was no official cause of death, it was easier for defense attorneys, for skeptics, for anyone protecting the killer to say, "Well, maybe we don't know what really happened." But we do. We know Katelyn didn't just go missing on her own. We know she didn't just lie down in the woods and die. We know that whoever did this got rid of her body in a way that made sure she wouldn't be found until it was too late to get clear answers. And that was intentional. That was someone covering their tracks. And it almost worked. For years, Katelyn's case went cold. Her father, Dave Markham, kept fighting for justice, kept pushing for answers. But the lack of a cause of death kept standing in the way. Until, finally, years later, there was a break in the case. All right, let's talk about one of the biggest red flags in this entire case. John Carter's 911 call. Now, when a loved one goes missing, especially under suspicious circumstances, how do you think a normal person would react? Panic, desperation, frantic energy. Maybe they're hyperventilating, maybe they can barely get the words out, maybe they sound completely overwhelmed with fear. Because this is someone they love. This is someone they were supposed to protect, and now they're gone. But John Carter? His call to 911? It was anything but normal. Let's set the scene. It was Sunday, August 14, 2011, the day after Katelyn Markham was last seen. John Carter picked up the phone and called 911 to report her missing. This was the moment when you'd expect to hear a terrified, panicked fiancé, someone on the verge of a breakdown, someone begging for help. But instead, he sounded way too calm. And if you listen to that call, and trust me, a lot of people have, you can hear it for yourself. It's oddly rehearsed. It's strangely controlled. It's like he already had the script in his head before he even dialed the number. Now, let's break this down. The 911 dispatcher picks up and right away John jumps in with, "Hi, my name's John Carter. I'm calling I know that you're not supposed to report a missing person before 24 hours, but my fiancée is missing and I can't find her anywhere." Okay, pause. First of all, that's not true. That whole "you have to wait 24 hours to report someone missing" thing, that's a myth. If someone vanishes under suspicious circumstances, you do not wait, especially when it's someone like Katelyn, who was responsible, who didn't just disappear without telling anyone. And second, just listen to how he phrases it. "I know that you're not supposed to report a missing person before 24 hours. That sounds way too prepared. It sounds like someone who's already thought about what the dispatcher is going to say, like he's trying to preemptively control the conversation. But here's where it gets even weirder. Throughout the entire call, John never really sounds upset. His tone is steady, emotionless. It's almost like he's making a casual phone call, like he's ordering a pizza instead of reporting his fiancée missing. And listen, I'm not saying that everyone reacts the same way in a crisis. Some people shut down, some people go into shock, but this wasn't just calm, this was too calm. And then he does something that makes every single true crime expert's alarm bells go off. He starts oversharing. Now, this is huge. When people are genuinely reporting a missing person, they usually stick to the facts. They tell the dispatcher, "My fiancée is missing. I last saw her at this time. She wasn't here when I came back." That's normal. But John? He immediately starts giving extra information that nobody even asked for. He tells the dispatcher, "We were planning on moving to Colorado soon. She was excited. She wouldn't just disappear." Why bring that up? Because that's something a guilty person does. They try to convince people of the story before they've even been accused. Instead of just saying, "She's missing, please help," he's already planting the idea that, "Hey, she had no reason to run away, so don't even think about that." And it gets worse. At one point in the call, John says something that sends chills down your spine. He pauses, almost like he's thinking, and then he mutters under his breath something that some people believe sounds like, "I killed her." Now let's be clear, that part of the audio isn't 100% definitive. Some people think he said something else, something less incriminating, but the fact that it even sounds like that, the fact that enough people hear it that way, that's disturbing. And here's where things get even more suspicious. After that oddly calm 911 call, John Carter agreed to take a polygraph test. You know, those lie detector tests that measure heart rate, blood pressure, and stress responses to see if someone is being truthful or deceptive. And guess what? He failed. Not once, twice. Now, let's talk about polygraphs for a second. Are they 100% reliable? No. That's why they aren't admissible in court. Some people can pass them while lying, and some people can fail them even if they're telling the truth, just because of stress or anxiety. But failing two of them? That's not normal. That's not bad luck. That's a pattern. And what did John do after failing those tests? Did he keep cooperating with the police? Did he insist on his innocence? No. He lawyered up. Now, listen. Getting a lawyer doesn't automatically mean someone is guilty. It's actually a smart thing to do. But when you combine everything together, the 911 call that sounded rehearsed, the oversharing, the weird whispered confession, the two failed polygraphs, and then immediately getting a lawyer, it doesn't look good. At this point, investigators were seriously looking at John Carter as a suspect. But the problem? They didn't have enough evidence, and because Katelyn's cause of death was undetermined, they didn't have anything solid to charge him with. So what happened? Nothing. For years, John Carter walked free. No charges, no arrests, just a cloud of suspicion hanging over him. And here's the most frustrating part. If Katelyn's body had been found sooner, if her remains had been intact enough to determine a cause of death, this might have gone completely differently. But because her killer was careful, because they made sure her body was hidden and decomposed beyond recognition, investigators were left with no way to prove how she was murdered. And John Carter? He just kept living his life. But the question remains, was that the voice of an innocent man on that 911 call? Or was it someone who already knew the truth? All right, so let's talk about what happened next. Because this case, Katelyn Markham's disappearance and murder, was stuck in limbo for years. Imagine that. Imagine being her family, her friends, her loved ones. You go through the worst possible nightmare first. She disappears. Then, nearly 2 years later, her remains are found in a garbage bag in a remote wooded area. And after all of that, after so much waiting, so much pain, the police still have nothing solid. No arrests, no official suspects, no justice. Katelyn Markham's case went completely cold. And that's the thing about cold cases. It's not just that the investigation stops, it's that time starts working against you. The longer it takes to find answers, the harder it becomes. Memories fade, witnesses move away, evidence deteriorates. The people who might have talked when the case was fresh, they start to shut up. They start to convince themselves it's not their problem anymore. And Katelyn's family, they were living with this every single day. Her father, Dave Markham, never gave up. He pushed for answers. He kept her name in the public eye, doing everything he could to make sure she wasn't forgotten. He knew deep down that someone out there knew the truth. Because let's be real, murders like this, they don't happen in a vacuum. Someone had to see something. Someone had to know something. But for years there was nothing. And then finally there was a break. New evidence. New leads. A renewed investigation. And suddenly, John Carter's name was back in the headlines. So what happened? What changed? Well, for one thing, there were whispers. Whispers that John had told someone something he shouldn't have. Because here's the thing about secrets, they don't stay buried forever. And people, they talk. Especially when the guilt starts creeping in. Now, officially, police haven't released every detail about the new evidence they found. But what we do know, it was big enough to get the case moving again. In 2023, more than a decade after Katelyn disappeared, John Carter was finally arrested and charged with her murder. And this was huge, because for years he had been walking around as a free man. Despite the suspicious 911 call, despite failing polygraphs, despite being the last person to talk to Katelyn before she vanished, there was never enough hard evidence to charge him. Until now. Now let's talk about what this means. First, it means that police never really stopped investigating. Even when the case seemed completely dead, even when it looked like Katelyn's killer had gotten away with it, investigators were still waiting for the right moment. Because with cold cases you have to be patient. Sometimes it takes years for people to start talking. Sometimes the right piece of evidence doesn't show up until much later. And sometimes the guilty party slips up. And that's the most important part of all this, because if John Carter is guilty, then for over a decade he was walking around free. He was living his life while Katelyn's family suffered. He was acting like the grieving fiancé, the heartbroken man who had lost the love of his life, when in reality, he might have been the one who killed her. Now obviously the case still has to go to trial. John Carter will have his chance to defend himself. The prosecution will have to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he's the one responsible for Katelyn's murder. But let's be real, this didn't come out of nowhere. You don't just get arrested for murder after a decade, unless the police have something serious on you. And the fact that the case suddenly heated up again, that's not an accident. That means something big happened behind the scenes. Maybe it was a witness finally coming forward. Maybe it was a key piece of forensic evidence they had been sitting on, waiting for the technology to improve. Maybe it was a confession, even if it wasn't from John himself. Maybe it was someone he trusted who decided they didn't want to keep his secret anymore. Either way, justice for Katelyn is finally within reach. And after all these years, after all the frustration, after all the pain of not knowing her family might finally get the answers they deserve. All right, let's get into the biggest bombshell in this case, the discovery of a diary in 2023. A diary that contained something so shocking, so explosive, that it turned everything on its head. For over a decade, Katelyn Markham's murder was unsolved. Investigators had theories, the public had suspicions, and John Carter, her fiancé, was always at the center of it. From the weird 911 call, to failing multiple polygraphs, to lawyering up when things started getting too close for comfort. But in 2023, a new name entered the conversation. Michael Strauss, and the way he was linked to Katelyn's case. A diary, a personal handwritten confession found in his own words, tying him to Katelyn's disappearance and death. Now let's take a step back and talk about who Michael Strauss even is. He's not some random name that came out of nowhere. If you're familiar with true crime, especially cases in Ohio, you might already know him. Because in 2018, 7 years after Katelyn vanished, Michael Strauss was convicted of murder. And not just any murder. He strangled 23-year-old Ellen Ellie Wyke to death in a disturbingly similar way to how police believe Katelyn may have been killed. Let that sink in for a second. For years, the focus was on John Carter. But all this time, another killer was hiding in plain sight. A man who had already taken the life of another young woman. And now, thanks to this diary, it looked like he was confessing to Katelyn's murder, too. So let's talk about this diary. Investigators found detailed entries, written in Michael Strauss's own handwriting, where he allegedly described Katelyn's death. And not just vague details, specific details that only someone involved would know. It was a confession. But it wasn't like he sat down and wrote, "I killed Katelyn Markham." No, these things are rarely that simple. What made it so damning was the way he described what happened, the way he implicated himself without even realizing it. He wrote about being there. He wrote about the night she disappeared. He mentioned details about her body, the way it was hidden, the way it was found, things that weren't public knowledge at the time. And this was huge. Because for over a decade, investigators didn't have physical evidence. They didn't have DNA. They didn't have security footage. They didn't have a murder weapon. What they needed was someone to talk. And Michael Strauss, he talked, just not in the way he expected. Now, why would he write something like this down? Why would a convicted killer put his own crimes into writing? It's actually more common than you'd think. Serial offenders, especially those who strangle their victims, like Strauss did to Ellie Wyke, often feel this overwhelming need to relive their crimes. They write about them, they keep trophies, they even return to the crime scene just to revisit the moment of control they had over their victim. And Strauss, he was already in prison for one murder. Maybe he thought nobody would ever find the diary. Maybe he thought that if he wasn't getting out anyway, it didn't matter anymore. But when that diary was discovered, it changed everything. Because now the police had a new suspect. Someone who had already proven he was capable of murder. Someone who had already targeted and strangled a woman before. And here's where things get even more twisted. When police started digging into Strauss's past, they realized something else. He wasn't just some random guy. He and John Carter, they knew each other. Think about that for a second. For years, people thought John Carter was the only one involved. But now, with this new diary, there was a whole new theory emerging. Did John Carter and Michael Strauss know more than they ever let on? Was Katelyn's death the result of something bigger? Did Strauss act alone? Or was there more to the story? And most importantly, how did Katelyn really die? Because remember, her cause of death was never officially determined. Her remains were too decomposed by the time they were found. But now, with Struz's diary allegedly describing what happened to her, investigators finally had a new direction to go in. And let's be real, this diary. This was not the kind of thing you just brush off. This wasn't some wild conspiracy theory. This was a handwritten confession. And that was finally enough to take this case out of the cold and back into the spotlight. Alright, so let's talk about who Michael Struz really is, because once you start pulling at the threads of his past, things start looking really dark, really dark. This guy, he wasn't just some random name that popped up in Katelyn Markham's case. He wasn't some innocent bystander caught in the crossfire of an investigation that had been going on for over a decade. No, Michael Struz had a history, and not just any history, a history of violence against women. And this isn't speculation. This isn't guesswork or some far-fetched theory. This is fact, because Michael Struz was already convicted of murder. Let's rewind to 2018, 7 years after Katelyn disappeared. At this point, Katelyn's case was cold. Her killer was still out there, and the people who loved her were still waiting for justice. And meanwhile, Michael Struz was out living his life, until he did it again. This time the victim was Ellie Wyke, a 23-year-old woman from Westchester, Ohio. She was young, she was kind, she had her whole life ahead of her, and just like Katelyn, she never saw it coming. Michael Struz stalked her. Let that sink in. This wasn't some random act of violence. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. He had been watching her, learning her routine, figuring out how to get close enough without raising suspicion, and when the time was right, he strangled her. Now that's important, because strangulation is a very specific kind of murder. It's up close, personal, and controlling. It's not like using a gun or a knife, it's about power. The killer has to be right there, watching as their victim fights for their life. It's the kind of murder that's often tied to control issues, rage, and a deep desire to dominate. And Struz? He wasn't just a guy who snapped. He was a predator. After killing Ellie, he hid her body just like Katelyn's. He dumped her in a remote field, far from where anyone would find her right away. He wanted her to disappear, just like Katelyn had. And here's the part that should send chills down your spine. If he hadn't been caught for Ellie's murder in 2018, how many more victims would there have been? Because these kinds of killers, they don't stop. Now fast forward to 2023, when his name got dragged into Katelyn Markham's case. At this point, Struz is already behind bars, serving time for Ellie's murder. But when that diary was discovered, when he was suddenly linked to Katelyn's death, investigators realized they needed to dig deeper into his past. And what they found? It wasn't just these two cases. Michael Struz had a pattern of behavior. Before he escalated to murder, there were red flags everywhere. Reports of stalking, harassment, obsession with women. He had been accused before, but never in a way that led to serious consequences until Ellie. And that raises a terrifying question. If police had caught him sooner, could Katelyn have been his first victim? Because think about it, when Katelyn went missing in 2011, Struz was still free. He was out there, capable of violence, capable of murder. And now, with his own handwritten diary linking him to Katelyn's case, the pieces were finally starting to fit together. So now the big question, was he acting alone? Because remember, John Carter was also arrested in 2023, and that opened up a whole new layer of mystery. Were John Carter and Michael Struz connected? Did they both play a role in Katelyn's death? Was this a case of one person acting alone? Or was it something far more disturbing? We may not have all the answers yet, but here's what we do know. Michael Struz was already a convicted killer. And now, he was finally being looked at for Katelyn's murder too. It took years, but justice was finally starting to catch up with him. All right, so here we are. After more than a decade of unanswered questions, of theories, of a family living in agony, waiting for the truth, the case was finally reopened. And not just reopened for some routine check. No, this time there were real developments, real arrests. And for the first time in years, there was hope that justice for Katelyn Markham might actually happen. Let's go back for a second and look at how we even got here. For years, the case was cold. Katelyn had vanished in 2011. Her remains were found 2 years later. And even though police had their suspicions, especially about John Carter, there was never enough solid evidence to make an arrest. But then in 2023, everything changed. First, there was the diary. Michael Struce, already a convicted killer, already in prison for murdering another young woman, was suddenly linked to Katelyn's case. His own words described what had happened to her, in ways that only someone involved would know. And at that moment, everything that had been stagnant for years suddenly had momentum again. Investigators started digging deeper. They looked back at old evidence with fresh eyes. They reevaluated John Carter's role, the strange 911 call, the failed polygraphs, the way he acted after Katelyn disappeared. And finally, after 12 years, there was enough to make an arrest. John Carter was charged with Katelyn's murder. And this was huge, because for over a decade people had speculated that he knew more than he let on. But now the police had enough to say, "We believe you did this." And let's be clear, police don't just randomly arrest someone for murder after 12 years. They don't take that risk unless they are sure they have something solid. So now the case is finally moving forward. John Carter is behind bars. Michael Struce's diary is being picked apart as evidence. And after years of pain, years of Katelyn's loved ones not knowing what happened, the justice system is finally catching up to the truth. But here's the real question: is this the end of the story? Or is there more to come? Because if this case has proven anything, it's that secrets don't stay buried forever. And the truth always finds its way to the surface.